to be here today. My name is Jay Brown. I am the Senior Vice President of Programs, Research and Training at the Human Rights Campaign. And we are here today for the Allies and Advocates session as part of the Translation Summit. We're joined today by three incredible advocates. And rather than sort of tell you about them, I'd love to bring them on to the camera here to talk a little bit about themselves. So first, I'm going to start with Avery.
Hello all, it's a pleasure to be with you today. My name is Avery Bellew. My pronouns are she, her, and hers. I am the Regional Director for Land Legal's South Central Regional Office, which is based in Dallas, Texas, and I hang my hat in Dallas-Fort Worth, Texas. Lizette, I'll turn it over to you.
Hi everyone, my name is Lizette Trujillo. My pronouns are she, her, hers, and I am a parent advocate for a 13-year-old trans son, as well as others in my area. And I am also a member of the Human Rights Campaign Parents for Trans Equality Council. And then I would like to kick it off to Kavanaugh Quick.
Thanks so much, Lizette. Hi, everybody. My name is Kavanaugh Quick. My pronouns are they, them. I am a licensed and practicing psychotherapist up in Albany, New York. I work with Choices Counseling and Consulting, and I serve trans folk of all ages and their families and community members.
Thank you all for coming. It's so wonderful to have you here today. And I wish we could all be in person, but being in this virtual room together is great. And we're going to talk today a little bit about sort of some of the things that came up in the film Transhood, and sort of in your sort of experience as advocates and allies, so that folks who are watching at home can take those lessons and apply them in their daily lives. Feel free to jump in. If I ask a question, you want to add to somebody's point, feel free to jump in, raise your hand, and I'll turn it over to you. But we have some great questions and great folks, and I cannot wait to sort of hear from you. So the first thing I want to start with is really through various points in the film, we see trans people and their families navigate transition in many different forms, whether that's social, medical, legal. I transitioned nearly 2 decades ago and felt fairly isolated in that experience. I was often working with colleagues, doctors, and others who'd never really experienced somebody in their lives transitioning before. I had exceptional sort of support from a lot of different places, but I still felt sort of alone. Some great responses from some folks, some not so great responses from others. Kavanaugh, I would love to start with you as a therapist, sort of given your expertise. What are your thoughts about the best ways that folks can show up for their loved ones through transition?
That's a wonderful question, Jay. Thank you. So I also transitioned about a decade ago and had a similar experience of really a lot of people, and I hear this phrase still today, they say, I had a good support, but a frequent phrase that I hear is, we'll love you or care about you no matter what, no matter who you are. And that phrase is like, beautiful. And it's a wonderful starting point, but I actually think we can do more than that to create an environment. So something about that phrase, it's different than saying, I'm invested in actively discovering, sharing, nurturing who you are, right? Mm-hmm. One of the things that our community members and allies and advocates can do is begin an active participation in the discovery and curation of trans self, especially when we're talking about our young people. Right? The idea that you'll love me no matter who I am is great, but it suggests that one day I'm just going to present a version of myself to you. And when that happens, you'll be on board. I'm really looking for the version that says, hey, I want to meet you over and over and over again. I want to nurture and nourish every part of you that exists in every iteration. And I'm going to love all versions of that. So one of the first things that we can do is shift that framework. It's not just who I'm going to be one day, but who I am now and all the changes that might happen along the way.
That's a great point. I love that. Anybody else have thoughts about how to really support transition in practical ways as a parent or a friend?
You know, I really resonated, Kavanaugh, with what you were saying around every point in someone's journey to understand that there's multiple phases and that many times folks will experiment and be curious. I know for myself, I came out as genderqueer about 5 years before I made the decision to transition and live as a trans woman, right? So I explored with pronouns. I explored with my gender expression. There was all sorts of things going on. And many times this was in a professional environment. Friends and family were there to witness all of that. So I think your point is such a powerful one, that it's about being present along each step of the journey, not just some perhaps fully realized or ideal sense of what someone would envision us to become as trans folks.
Avery, that brings me to another point of transition that I think is something that a lot of folks have troubles with, and it really changes depending on where you live, what is happening in the legislature at that point. The legal aspects of transition. They can be super daunting for non-lawyers out there. You're a non-lawyer who works with a lot of lawyers, so you're the perfect person to address this question. What recommendations do you have when it comes to how parents and guardians can really show up to support their loved ones through that process?
It's an excellent question. So what I would say is knowledge is power. There is a kind of complicated matrix of what it looks like state by state to address the legal aspects of transition for some folks, if you choose to engage in that part of the process, remembering that transition looks different for everyone. And so some folks may make changes to identity documents and some folks may not. But for folks for whom that's part of their journey, it can be really daunting, as you stated. I transitioned here in Texas, and so that part is especially something that provides folks a lot of anxiety in some parts of the country that may be less affirming. So what I would say is that there's some great places folks can go to learn more about what is the state of being able to transition legally and in the sense of documents state by state. So if you go to landlegal.org, shameless pitch for my organization, we have a robust set of infrastructure online to help people understand state by state what requirements are, what things you might need to prepare for that process, as well as organizations at the state level that are willing to assist you and help hold your hand through that process. So that's a great first place to start for a parent or anyone who is trying to walk alongside someone as part of their process. The second thing I would say is if you do face discrimination in that process, if you're engaged in the process and you feel that somehow you are being discriminated against, one of the things I love about Lambda Legal is that we manage a legal help desk. And you can find the link on our website really, really simply if you go to lambdalegal.org. And we have attorneys that are eager to chat with folks, parents and trans folks who may be experiencing discrimination in that process and help them understand what their best next step is. The last thing I would really say is no matter what you may choose to do or not do as regards kind of a legal transition, if someone is trying to assist someone, whether it's their child or a friend, I think a great thing to always do is to ask the question, how can I support you? What does support look like to you? So don't make assumptions around what help someone may need, but ask them as to where they're at in their journey, how you can be of help. Maybe it's doing some of that research. Maybe it's just accompanying them to the courthouse if they need just someone's hand to hold as they go through some of those somewhat daunting processes.
I appreciate that.
I also, as a parent, felt like, just to echo what both Kavanaugh and Avery have said, I felt like it was really important for me to be present and not expect my 8-year-old to teach me what needed to happen. And so I find that community is healing. And not only is it healing, but it's where collective information and collective knowledge is shared amongst family and community and parents. And so I always tell parents who are new to their gender journey, their child's transition and their transition in growing and understanding and expanding their awareness around gender, is to find local communities and connect with people. I felt like it was so important for my son to see that I had other trans people and other queer people and LGBTQ people in my life, to see that I had fostered friendships and community so that he wasn't feeling isolated and alone in his experience.
I so appreciate that, Lizette. I think that's super important. Kavanaugh, did you have something you wanted to add on there?
Yeah, well, there's that beautiful nurturing, that saying that I'm actively involved, and also moving beyond the step of just because it's you, right? I actually care about this in a broad sense. So often our instinct is to try to protect and get a little insular so that we are maybe removing the opportunity for a stress or bad experience from our folk and our community members. But we actually need interdependence. We work well when we are relying on the needs, the experiences, the knowledge, the resources of others, and then offering what we have. It's a really good and beautiful model for learning to ask for what we need and being joyful in the freely giving of what we need and what others need.
Yeah, that's great. I love that. I also think there's a balance, right, between doing sort of going out there and learning and also not not letting that person lead, right? So always letting the trans person sort of guide the path a little bit, not an 8-year-old guiding that path, but sort of guiding you where they want you to be, right? So I have met a couple of folks who almost take allyship to an extreme that can get in the way of letting the trans person lead. So I think does anybody have any thoughts on that, and how to balance that so that you're not sort of getting in front of the person?
Yeah, as a parent, that's like the hardest part, especially if you're a parent of a younger person, is not jumping too far ahead, but allowing them the opportunity to grow into who they are. And so, but it's a fine line. I mean, I know I've had parent fails, and I often tell my kid, I've never been a mom before, and I'm figuring it out as we go. But I think that the most important thing that I have always told my child is that I'm excited to meet you where you're at and for you to meet me where I'm at. Because I think a lot of times parents, who are we too, right? We're constantly evolving and growing. And I think that having had this experience with my child exploring their gender, I too have had the opportunity to be humbled and say, I'm learning as I go too. And this is kind of fun. We can do this together. But you're right. It's a fine line between where a parent can push too far forward. And then also too, now he's 13, so he's very clear as to what he wants. But when he was smaller, it was also understanding where I, as a mother, needed to step in and advocate, and where I, as a mother, maybe needed to make some choices for his own safety and well-being.
Yeah, I appreciate that. Lizette, as a member of HRC's Parents Council, you and I have had an ability to get up to some good trouble before, and we've talked a lot about community and sort of this belief, this false belief that community is a monolith, right? And our intersecting identities, race, religion, ability, gender, and so on, they can all impact how we experience transition. For example, when I transitioned, I got handed all of the privileges that come with being seen as a straight white man in the United States today and for decades. We've talked, Lizette, you and me, about your family's experience as Latinx communities, which also are not monoliths, let's be clear. Can you share a bit about how you supported your son's transition and what your experience has been in community from an intersectional perspective?
Absolutely. It's so much about our background centered around how we would move forward in our understanding of it. So for those of you who don't know me, I'm going to assume I am first generation Mexican American. Both of my parents immigrated when they were 3 and 5 years old. So they are very much American by all kind of understanding. My spouse is immigrated when he was 9. And so, I, as a first generation, obviously had a different experience growing up than his. So our family was also very aware of that this was a harder thing. You are already dealing with being a person of color in a society where you are impacted by racism or impacted by colorism and all the other things that come into play. And so when you tell your family that now you're having this experience, first of all, my father was like, it's going to be hard. Now you're layering something else on top of it. But he was affirming. And for our other side of my husband's family, this was like, this is very American. This is not our experience. And we had to cut ties for a while, which is painful, clearly. But I was always the type of mother that, although we were not in direct connection with them, I was annoyingly on the family Facebook thread sharing information. I think that the most important thing for me as a woman of color, as a woman first generation, is to say that there is a beauty and a fullness in accepting our children. And I hate to use the word accept, but in loving our children fully and unconditionally. And it is important for us to be creating change and awareness and giving information to our family members, because through proximity, we change hearts. And if I start with my family and then they start with their friends and their extended family, we can truly create change in communities. I think it's so important for other Latinx families to see that there are people that are supporting and loving their children and doing it with ease. Because if they can see that I'm doing it with ease and I'm navigating this and I'm teaching my family ways to be like responsible ways to be allies and advocates in their own small ways, then we're really truly working towards a more inclusive country, I hope. And so intersectionality is really important. I also just want to say, for those who end up seeing pictures of my kid, he is a fair-skinned male. And so I'm constantly talking to him about the fact that his experience will be different from other trans people's experiences once you layer in, the feminine experience or, the violence against Black trans women. Clearly, he's never going to face that. And so it's his responsibility to then be an ally in that way, right? Yeah. We all have to do our parts.
I appreciate that. Powerful. The title of this session, speaking of all of us doing our parts, is Allies and Advocates in Action. And that action part is really intentional. So I want to talk a little bit more. We've started talking about this, but the fact that it's really a continuous journey, right? Take name and pronoun changes just as an example. Step one for me is really just doing it and doing it right, doing it consistently right. Step two might be making sure that all those folks around you, that if you hear somebody misgendering somebody who uses they, them pronouns, you're calling them in and correcting them in a way that's appropriate and nurturing and gets somebody to getting it right, and affirms the trans person's or non-binary person's identity. But step three is really like taking that to the systemic level, right? And so I think that's something that some folks have a hard time wrapping their heads around. But I had a really great experience with a mom recently who's a friend of mine who I know, and she talks about herself as not being sort of out there. She's not sort of a loud advocate, but she got a message from her school during this virtual training or virtual schooling that sort of said they were switching virtual platforms, and there was going to be a switch that didn't allow students to change their name or pronouns. And she read between the lines, and she actually sort of learned that they were going to be just putting legal names on there, which obviously causes a huge issue for trans students who are already out. And then it causes a whole nother issue for trans and non-binary students who are coming out, right? So she didn't just go to the teacher of her child and say, hey, we need a workaround for my kid. She actually went to the school board member. She reached out to advocates like me. She organized behind the scenes. There was no press about this. And within, I think it was 2 days, the school had figured out a workaround. And it was countywide that she came up with a solution. So that's the difference, right? Between the individual versus the system, and how you can change things in a very positive way for a lot of kids that you might not ever even interact with. So I would love to hear from all of you. What are some suggestions you have for folks who are looking for that in action, who are trying to take things from individual to systems level change, especially when it comes to the experiences of trans and non-binary people in their lives? Who wants to start? Kavanaugh, I'm going to go with you.
Great. I love a good voluntelling. One thing that comes to mind as a fatal mistake we often make as advocates and allies is assuming that the things we're helping our trans loved ones tackle are somehow unique and never have come up in anybody else's life, right? So one of the first things we can do is actually think on the broad level. When we work from the people who are being the most underserved, we're serving our whole community, and we can start assessing what is useful about and where can we make maximum change in one specific area. So when we think about not just the trans folks who maybe hadn't come out yet in that classroom or were already out, right? We started there, and then who might struggle with that, but also any number of reasons why we might want to have control over how we're presenting ourselves to our community members and our classroom and our teacher, right? So one of the things that you can do if you're really called to find room to move into systemic action is start looking at, when we move from the underserved, what else can we gather in that wave, right? There are certainly elements when we think about how we make assumptions about people's presentations based on how they dress or how they look, for example. It's not just trans folk who are caught up in that, right? Women of all experience are caught up in that, right? We make a lot of assumptions about people based on layering things like their race, right? Their gendered expectations. And that guides so much of our interaction with one another. So the first thing I say is identify a problem and then roll it out as expansively as you can. Who else might not know that this is a problem that's impacting them, for example, and also might not know that there is a way to do it differently? It's never just one of us that is helped. It's always all of us, especially when we start from the people who are being the most systematically ignored.
Yeah, that's great. Avery, Lizette, do you have thoughts on that?
Yeah, absolutely. The first thing that comes to my mind is practice being appropriately curious. I feel like one of the things that is most beautiful about transgender and gender non-binary and non-conforming folks is that we're constantly changing rules, breaking rules, growing, changing. Our community is very dynamic. And so what I often tell people is, even if you've read a book about trans folks or you've watched now this documentary, 2, 3, 4 years from now, there's likely going to be new terms, new ways of understanding ourselves, because this next generation of young folks is going to challenge us and encourage us to see things in new ways. So practice being appropriately curious and being a little uncomfortable, because I think that's part of what this journey requires from all of us, is to practice doing that together in community. The other thing I would say is, if you're really interested in systemic change, is to support the leadership of trans folks, both trans young people who are leading in their own communities and trans-led organizations. There's so much beautiful work going on right now that's focused on systemic change, that's being led particularly by Black and POC transgender people. Find out what those organizations are, find those leaders, and find ways to support them.
That's great. Lizette, do you have thoughts on this?
I always tell people, especially, I'm so sorry.
No, go for it.
Yeah, I was going to say, I always tell new families or allies or people, okay, who ask, how can I get involved? I always remind people life is experiential. You don't know what you don't know. And so connecting with people who are different with you, being uncomfortable in those spaces, and being okay with being wrong. I think people are very afraid of that discomfort of not knowing something. And there's no way we could know all things. And so I think that if you start opening your heart and opening yourself to new experiences, you'll find those pockets of where you can be helpful. And that being helpful can be big as district wide, or it could be in your neighborhood, or it could just be with one person, but it all matters, right? And so that's how we build strong, healthy communities, is by paying attention and being thoughtful and opening ourselves up.
I love that. I mean, I think, several of you have said some things I want to sort of dig in a little bit deeper on. And I know that we don't have a ton of time, but I would like to sort of, Avery, you said appropriately curious, and Lizette, you talked about sort of I love the family fails, or I think friends fail, I think families fail. Can we, as a trans person, something that I experience a lot is sort of the things that sort of are not appropriately curious, right? Like the questions that come, the failures that you make early on, perhaps as an ally. And I would love to, as folks sort of who are watching, who are trying to become allies but don't want to step in it in the wrong way, maybe just a couple of do's and don'ts. What are your best do's and don'ts for the general audience that's watching here? I will start with go online and learn what you can, right? So if you go to hrc.org/transgender, there's a ton of information there. There's a coming out resource that's really helpful for friends and family to understand different identities. There's research, there's things for parents specifically, but read what you can, watch what you can. Watching this is a great step. But before you start asking questions of trans people, learn from folks who are already talking, resources that are already out there. That would be one of my do's. One of my don'ts is, don't say, "Oh, I never knew you were transgender. I couldn't have told you that you were transgender. I didn't imagine that you were transgender." That is not something that any of us really appreciate. So those are my 2 do's and don'ts. Who wants to go next on sort of a quick, Lizette, go for it.
Don't reduce trans people to their bodies. When I first started this journey, luckily they never asked my 8-year-old, but they would ask me all the time about his body. And because I was new and it was like I was trying to figure things out, was like a raw wound of answers that I had no real answer to anyway. I would be like, I don't know, we'll figure it out when we get there. Or and then as I learned more and I just was like, oh, this is a bias. Reducing people to their body parts is how we view them. And they're so much more. My child will say that his being transgender is such a small part in comparison to all the things he loves to do and all the things that encompass him. It makes him special, but it's not the only thing. And so I would say, don't reduce trans people to their bodies. Don't ask questions you wouldn't want asked yourself. And do always be thoughtful and kind. I think wanting to know the person for who they are is the most important thing. And so that's the first do. I want to get to know you. And from that, you get to understand and learn from their experience.
Love that. Avery, you want to go next?
Sure. So thanks for grabbing onto that phrase, appropriately curious, because this is exactly where I was hoping we would go, because I think all of us have had these experiences. So I would say, do ask consent to learn more. And so a great question that I've had someone ask me is, may I ask you more about your journey? It's a nice open-ended question. They're asking for consent. And I love to talk about trans issues, so I'm very likely to say, sure. But, I may be like, you know what, not today, right? So ask for consent. I think another do is ask open-ended questions so that you're not being invasive. So for example, if someone shared with you they're trans, a great question is, can you tell me more about your journey? Or can you tell me more about what it means to be trans? What does that mean for you? On the adult side, I think very similarly to what you folks are saying is never ask questions about someone's body or about surgeries or medical transition. It's just not appropriate to ask those questions. And I think, Jay, your point was a great one, which is please do use Google. So I understand those questions are relevant and they're real, and there's a lot of really great, accurate information online.
Great. Kavanaugh?
Yeah, absolutely. One of my biggest do's is do support the people who are leading you through your education, whether that's fiscally, emotionally, especially fiscally though, right? Do continue making it possible for more people to learn. In that same vein, I really love, we always call it the Vegas rule whenever I'm working with my community members, which is take the things you learned, that should leave here, but the things that I said should stay here. So we want to respect people's privacy and their confidentiality, but the thing that I took about how I can move through my world and change that, absolutely take it and share it freely. Don't assume that my life is hard because I'm trans. My life is hard because of a lot of things, not necessarily just because I'm trans. And also when it has to do with being trans, it's usually that my life is hard because of how people treat me for being trans. Being trans itself, not a problem in my world.
I appreciate that. I appreciate all of you. We've been working with Warner Media on a collaboration to really reduce stigma, and we have a PSA that's out. If you go to hrc.org/trans, you'll see that. And I just want to thank all of you because you're doing important work that is reducing stigma around trans and non-binary identities. And I appreciate the conversation we've had today. I know that we have to sadly wrap up, but if you sort of had one parting word for everybody, what would you tell folks as they sort of go off to become allies and advocates in action? What's the last piece of recommendation you give to them? Avery, I'll start with you.
Kindness is so powerful. So to approach every part of this process, approach walking alongside people from a place of kindness in your heart. And with all the advice we've offered you today, and I don't think you can go wrong.
Lizette?
Oh no, one word. I guess I would just say be okay with being uncomfortable. That's where growth happens. And so be willing to grow and be open to it.
Love that. Kavanaugh?
Yeah, I would offer the reminder that accountability is an act of love. When somebody says, hey, I want you to do better, I think you can do better, I think you can do different, it's because they actually want to continue being around you and having you in their life. It's not because they think that you're a terrible person or are trying to get rid of you. We don't put energy into things we don't care about.
I love that. That's so great. I love you all. Thank you very much. And thank you, HBO, for bringing us together.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you for joining me and HBO and all of our wonderful partners for day one of Translation Summit. I hope you all took something valuable away from today's discussions. Please feel free to share the videos from today with your family, friends, and followers on socials using hashtag Translation Summit. Make sure to join us tomorrow, Wednesday, November 18th, right here for day 2 of the summit, focusing on growing up trans. Or if you're joining us at a later date, you can watch all videos from the Translation Summit on HBO's YouTube page.